If so, then you move on to the next element, which is causation. Then you need to look at actual cause. Were the defendant's actions the actual literal cause of the plaintiff's injury? And then you look at whether or not the injury was also the foreseeable result. So what we're going to do today with the Haverly-Maku case is I'm going to divide you guys into juries. I think we'll probably do two good-sized juries. We'll do, two juries. Sometimes I do smaller groups, but I would prefer to keep the juries as close to a realistic size as possible. An actual jury here in California is typically going to be 12 jurors. We don't quite have, we don't quite have enough people to do that, but I can do two juries of 11, so that'll work pretty well. The first thing you're going to do when I break you up into your juries is you're going to select a foreman. Okay, the jury foreman is the person who's going to speak for your group. When you get done with your deliberations, we're going to come back here to this room, and you guys will tell me what verdict you reached and how. The foreman is not the only person who's going to talk. I want everybody from the group to kick in and to be part of the discussion. But the jury foreman is the person who's going to sort of lead the deliberations, okay? You're the person who's going to make sure that all the elements of negligence are discussed and that you look at the elements of negligence for each of the two defendants. We're going to get to that in just a minute. In your assignment for today and in the reading, you might remember that it says Haverly, the engineer, is being sued, but Caltrans was essentially let out of the lawsuit, okay? I want you to pretend, for the purposes of this discussion, that that is not what happened. I want you to pretend that Caltrans is still part of the lawsuit, because realistically, I don't think they would be let out that quickly. I think they would certainly be part of the lawsuit. So I want you to include Caltrans as a defendant. So when you're doing your deliberations, you're first going to have to look at all the elements, duty, breach, and causation for Haverly. Then you're going to have to look at all the elements, duty, breach, and causation for Caltrans. You're going to decide if both of them are liable, if neither of them are liable, or if one of them is liable and one is not. Totally up to you. Then, when you get done with that, you need to look at comparative negligence vis-a-vis Maku, the guy who died. You remember we said in California, if you have a situation where somebody gets hurt, but they were also sort of contributing to their own injury in some way, we can sort of like apportion the liability. And that's what I want you to look at here. So after you decide whether or not there's liability for Haverly and Caltrans, then I want you to look at Maku and to say, okay, is he in any way responsible for his own injury? If so, then I want you to apportion the liability among those three parties. And you can apportion it any way you want. It can be, 15, 15, and 70. Doesn't matter. However you apportion it, as long as it comes out to 100%, that's really all that matters. Before I break you up into your juries, do you guys have any questions? Okay. During the exercise, I'm going to bounce back and forth between the two juries and see how you're doing. But the first thing you need to do as soon as I break you up into your juries is select someone who's going to be the jury foreman, okay? I'll check back in with you in a minute to see who you've selected. Give me just a second here and I'll assign you into breakout rooms. Said Haverly was 55%.
Yes, I do agree. I think we all agree with what Robert said, that he should have taken another soil test. I mean, that was one done in 98. So I think an updated one was probably necessary. that's kind of where we feel like he failed. He didn't perform his professional duties of care. So that's where we feel like he was wrong. But with Maku, we feel like there was a sign there. They had fenced off the work. We felt like he acted carelessly and thoughtlessly and just jumped in. So we do put a majority of the blame on him.
Okay. All right, good. Okay. So I have a few questions, and I want to open this up to everybody, regardless of what group you were in. If you have thoughts on this, please jump in. It's so hard to do this stuff on Zoom. When we do this in the class, like, discussion is just so much more sort of natural and less awkward, but here we are, right? So here's my first question. So I think everybody here would agree that relying on an old report, an outdated report, was probably negligent on Haverly's part, right? I think all of us just almost intuitively understand, that's bad. You shouldn't really rely on an old report like that. But what is the causal chain of events? What is the direct line between relying on the old report and Maku dying? Because we got to make that connection, right? To say that Haverly is responsible in any way, we have to be able to say, by relying on the old report, here's what happened that caused Maku to die. What is the argument there? Somebody tell me. I mean, you both found Maku liable, so you must have thought that there was something that he did that caused, or excuse me, you both found Haverly liable to some degree. So what did he do that caused Maku to die? Yeah, of course. So, okay. So your assumption, if I understand correctly, Robert, the assumption would be that if Haverly had generated a new report, he would likely have come up with a different type of support system that would have covered more of the trench. Okay. Okay. So I want to go back really quickly to something that you said before. You pointed out, Robert, when we were talking earlier, that the support itself did not fail, right? Maku was outside of the support. So if the support didn't fail, what are we saying? We're saying that there should have been, that the entire trench should have been supported, even the parts that people weren't working in? Right. That's right. That's right. And a worker, of course, probably would have been trained to know that they shouldn't be outside the trench box, right? I don't know if you guys, some of you probably have some experience with this, but I've had multiple clients over the years who, I've been on their work sites and I've seen how they do trenching, and usually they have this sort of U-shaped steel box and they kind of move it down the trench as they're working, and they're usually backfilling behind it, right? And they're working just kind of in the supported area. But definitely part of their training is you never get outside of the unsupported portion of the trench, right? Now, Maku, as was pointed out earlier, was a trespasser, wasn't he? He wasn't really supposed to be there at all. So here's a question that I throw open to all of you guys. Are trespassers foreseeable? If they are you required to take precautions to protect trespassers?
I think yes. Didn't we talk about that in the last class?
Mm-hmm. We did. Yeah. If you have a known danger on your property, which you could certainly argue that an open trench is a known danger, even though Maku's not supposed to be on that property, you still are potentially liable if he gets hurt. Okay, because you're on notice. You know that you have a dangerous condition on your property. Now, with this case, we don't really have enough facts to know exactly what precautions they were taking, do we? Like, we don't know if they had part of the trench covered. We don't know if they had the whole area fenced off very securely. We just don't really know. So there isn't really enough to go on there. When it comes to Maku, can he make the argument, or, well, he's dead, so he can't make any argument, but the people who are suing on behalf of him, can they make the argument that he needed to trespass? Because remember, we talked about how necessity can be a defense to trespass. Did he have a necessity to be on that property?
Yes, to collect his property.
Okay. So if so, does that totally remove him from having to act as a reasonable person, or does he still have to act reasonable even though he's in a situation where he may be able to argue necessity?
He'd probably be free of trespass, but wouldn't that take into account that he takes an acknowledgement of risk?
Yeah.
For that, so then it would be, liable for the negligence on his part.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's arguable whether or not he even had a necessity. I mean, this wasn't really like a life and death situation. This was just more I lost these, what is it, papers relating to this design he was working on. Maybe it was a necessity, maybe not. Even if it was, you are still required to act as a reasonable, prudent person under those circumstances. Here's the thing. So, generally speaking, I will tell you this. If you own a big piece of property, right? Whatever it is, a construction project, a shopping mall, that doesn't matter. If you own some kind of commercial piece of property, if somebody gets killed on your property, you're going to be writing a check, okay? Even if it's not your fault. So in this case, even though it's probably Maku's fault, and even though, we can maybe argue that Haverly, the engineer, was negligent by using the old report, etc., that property owner, Caltrans, they're going to be paying somebody. And it might even just be a situation where, even though they don't really have any serious liability, they might just pay a relatively small amount of money to just settle the case and make it go away, because you really just don't want to go to trial on something like this. This brings up my last point. You guys are what I would refer to as a pretty homogenous group. And what I mean by that is you're all, well, most of you are roughly in the same age range. You're all attending the same school. You're all studying the same thing. You're a fairly homogenous group of people. Even with that homogeneity in place, you guys came up with really, really different results here. Remember, jury number 1, 55% to Haverly. Jury number 2, 12%. That's a huge difference. Jury number 1, 35% to Maku. Jury number 2, 83% to Maku. Gigantic, huge differences. Do you think that in the real world, juries are made up of people as similar as you? Or are juries made up of like really totally different and disparate groups of people? Yes, right? I mean, do you think the average jury is comprised of 12 engineers? Not even close, right? Not even close. In fact, in a case like this, where engineering is at issue, you'd probably get kicked off early on. They probably wouldn't want an engineer on the jury, so you'd actually probably never make it to the jury. You'd get kicked off during the jury selection process. So what this case, I think, illustrates, and what those really divergent results that you guys came up with, what that illustrates is why you don't want to go to trial. Okay, this is why people settle cases, because people say, look, right now I can settle this case for, I'm making up a number, $100,000. Okay, what happens if I go to trial? Am I guaranteed that I'm going to pay less? No way. I mean, we see right here, it could have been 35% or it could have been 83%. And that is why a lot of times, even when you have absolutely no fault at all, when you've done nothing wrong, your lawyer might tell you, look, we're better off coming up with a number that we have some control over, that we have some ability to shape, rather than giving this to a jury of 12 people who don't care, right? And probably just want to get out of there and want to come up with a quick answer. This is why people settle cases. It's because juries are very unpredictable. It's really hard to say for sure what's going to happen in the jury deliberation process. So with that, I think we're wrapping this up pretty early. Do you guys have any questions before we go? Yeah, Robert. Yeah, yes, I would say so. It might depend too on how sympathetic or unsympathetic the dead person is. In a case like this, where you have an adult who, I think most of us agree, did something pretty stupid, right? He, jumped into this trench. That's a pretty dumb thing to do. Maybe you wouldn't get a lot of sympathy, but switch it up a little bit. What if Maku was a 6-year-old child? Would that change things? Yeah, it's going to change things in a big way, right? The jury is going to be way less sympathetic to a property owner or a construction company when a little kid gets killed on their property. And again, that's why, if I were representing that company, I would be saying, let's not go to trial. Let's find a way to figure this out before we get to that point. Oh, I have one question that I want to ask you guys, because I'm always fascinated to find out the answer here. Considering that you're all engineers, did that make you judge the engineer in this case more harshly, or did it make you a little more sympathetic to the engineer's position?
I felt like I judged him more harshly, because I just felt like there's such a push on being like diligent and being thorough. I just feel like he wasn't acting in the interest of everyone, the best interest.
Yeah. Because you're probably thinking about yourself and you're thinking, I would never rely on a 20-year-old reporter, right? That's crazy. So why would I cut this guy slack for doing that? Anybody else?
Professor, I had a quick question, actually.
Yes, Jeffrey.
Just out of curiosity, how would
someone else?
Sorry. Just out of curiosity, how would you have allocated the liability among the parties?
So I actually have a little bit of a different opinion here. I personally don't think, my views probably look a little bit more like jury 2. I don't think that Haverly has a huge amount of liability. I think that he definitely was negligent and he breached his duty of care by relying on the old report. I'm not totally convinced, though, that relying on the old report was what caused this guy to die. And the reason is because there was a support, and the support didn't fail. The guy died because he was in a part of the trench that was unsupported. Now, if additional expert testimony could show that, doing the report would have resulted in a different support system being recommended, one which would have, maybe supported the entire trench, I might feel differently. Likewise, it's possible that I would give more liability to Caltrans, because I might say, well, at the end of the day, regardless of what the engineer says, that's your job site, and it's your job to make sure that it's a safe job site. But I definitely would give personally, I'd probably give at least 50% to Maku, just because I think that a grown adult should know better than to jump into a trench. And if you do, you might die. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Professor, can
I
I
have a quick
talk
question.
to you? Oh, never mind.
Let me go to Jeffrey first.
I just have a quick question. Why would an engineer be removed from the jury selection?
So generally speaking, I'm speaking very broadly. There might be situations in which you would actually keep the engineer, but generally speaking, you wouldn't really want anyone on the jury who had a lot of knowledge and who you thought might be influential to the other jurors. So you might think, if you were the plaintiff's attorney, if you're the one suing, you might think, well, an engineer on the jury is going to be more sympathetic to the engineer, and they're going to explain how the engineering world works, and they're going to explain all of these, kind of inside baseball sort of things to the jury that is then going to sway the jury and make them more sympathetic to the engineer. Of course, it could be the opposite. As Lauren was saying, she was more critical of the engineer. So I guess it could also work that way. I would be inclined to not take the risk. I would prefer to have non-engineers on the jury. And I'll tell you another reason I would prefer that is because non-professionals tend to be a little more critical of professionals. They tend to hold them to a higher standard of care, right? Someone who's not an engineer expects the engineer to operate at a very, very, very high standard, and they're more likely to find liability there. Whereas an engineer might say, well, yeah, that was negligent, but I know how engineering works, and maybe this wasn't really that big of a deal. That might not be someone I would want on the jury. And I think, Sosa, did you have a question?
Oh, I just wanted to talk to you separately afterwards.
Sure, I'll stick around.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, no problem. Any other questions? All right. With that, I'll stick around to speak with you, Sosa, and everybody else. I'll see you guys soon. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.